Coming up on the live and interactive ACSA Legislative Lunch Break, Edgar and I will get you all of your latest news and information from the state capitol and CDE with an in-depth analysis of how it impacts your school community. Today, we are talking about the state budget. We'll talk about the Senate proposed budget and talk about what you need to know about next week's May revision.
The ACSA Legislative Lunch Break starts now.
And it's a couple of minutes after 1 o'clock. We welcome you on a Wednesday to the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break, along with ACSA's Executive Director, Dr. Edgar Zazwata. I'm Naj Alikhan, ACSA's Senior Director of Marketing and Communications. Again, welcome. We are honored to have you with us today. Go ahead and jump into the chat and say hello and let us know where you're watching from today. Edgar, how are you?
Good to be in Sacramento, at least for a few hours. It feels like I haven't been home for a lot of time here over the last couple of weeks, but I'm not complaining. That's not a complaint. It's part of the gig. But yeah, get to be here with you for a little bit of time. And then I'm back on a plane I'm excited to actually be headed down to one of our other conferences, our Lead with Pride, our second annual Lead with Pride conference in San Diego. So I am excited to be with some of our members and friends here later on this afternoon, this evening in San Diego.
Yep. Edgar and I will both be down at Lead with Pride. So if you are at that conference, please come say hello. Edgar will be signing autographs.
Well, I didn't sign up for that. I didn't know you were going to. No,
I am going. Yes.
I'm going to pretend I don't know you on the plane. Then I'm just going to walk by and keep my head down.
Hey, I'm not going till tomorrow morning. But this is the thing where you and I better coordinate outfits and not stand next to each other, since we get mistaken for each other all the time.
Yes.
Hey, Sheldon Smith first on the chat today. Jeff Oakes as well. Ellen Wheeler, Mark Campbell. Good to have all of you guys with us today. A couple of news headlines, and then we're going to bring in Patty Herrera from School Services of California to talk about that Senate budget proposal that came out late last week. And then the May revision, which is coming up next week. We'll tell you about our programming schedule with the May revision coming up next week. So Patty will join us in a couple of minutes. Edgar, I want to hit you on a couple of news items. First, we have this potential strike beginning as early as tomorrow as contract negotiations continue in Oakland Unified School District. The teachers union, according to the Oakland Tribune, East Bay Times, calling for a strike if an agreement wasn't reached. And as of right now, as of the latest reporting, no contract in place. The teachers have been pushing for increased pay, reduced class sizes, higher safety standards, and additional support services for students, according to the East Bay Times. And Edgar, you were just talking to me a couple of minutes ago that this is not the only school district in the Bay Area that is having some contentious contract negotiations.
No, I know there's some headlines about San Francisco also potentially thinking about or looking at a strike. I think and this is it's a challenging piece. I think it's a somewhat of a sign of the times. Obviously, we saw that in Los Angeles there was similar conversations happening. In that case, with their classified with SEIU, and then ultimately with UTLA, they were able to come to an agreement. And I think and I'd love to. I'll find a way to ask our guest, Patty, about this, because School Services does a lot of this work. But one of the things that we're seeing around the state is, given the changing fiscal environment, right? Because we've been in a standpoint where in a situation where we did have a lot of these revenues. And I think a lot of our partners or employee unions are talking about the work that really took place over the last couple of years. In some cases, what they believe that they need increases for a number of reasons, as you stated. I think what's making school districts nervous is that, like we're going to talk about, it is a change. While we're not talking about cuts, or we're not there yet, this is very different. We're going to have a very different budget conversation this year than we did even in January, and much less than we did over the last couple of years. So I think from a negotiation standpoint, one thing we hear from our leaders is that there may be a little bit more pressure on that end, because I think the labor partners also recognize it could be a very drastically different fiscal situation in a year or two from now. So hence the tensions go up. But yeah, hopefully they are able to come to resolution. We understand that that's part of the system. Our members know firsthand, those of them that have been through a strike. I mean, it's not an ideal situation, even the best of circumstances. And ultimately, when we have students missing instructions, not ideal. So yeah, hopefully our friends both in Oakland and San Francisco and anywhere else throughout the state that's dealing with this issue are able to come to some agreements here in coming weeks.
Yeah, again, a potential strike could start tomorrow in Oakland Unified. That likely would mean that students are not in the classroom, and that was the same situation. Edgar, remind me, I believe last year over in Sac City Unified, where the students were out of the classroom. Am I correct? That was last year. It's
That
so
was correct. Yes.
now.
Yes, it was last.
Okay. All right. One other thing that I wanted to point out, and this is from our good friends over at EdSource, our often visited John Fensterwald has this story on a study on U.S. history and civics. Nationwide testing of an understanding of U.S. history among eighth graders has continued a decade of decline, and for the first time, an understanding of civics has dropped. The study, which was conducted by the National Assessment of Educational Progress, found only 13% of those students scored proficient in history, and only 22% scored proficient in civics. 40% of students, according to this data, scored below the basic level of knowledge in U.S. history, a decline from 34% in 2018. The implication, according to this article by John Fensterwald, is that a large portion of students are lacking a strong foundation in the understanding of the subjects. Those students are entering high school, which is a very unique situation with civics and U.S. history in a highly politicized area, and some teachers are, dialing down some of the discussion that they're having in the classroom. That right there, Edgar, brings at least part of the story there about how politics and some of the teachers are really having to be fluid what they would normally be teaching the students. But just seeing some of these numbers right here, I mean, look, I'll be honest, my sophomore in high school cannot really get a grasp of the importance of world history, but U.S. history, highly important. And so seeing some of these numbers is definitely disappointing.
Yeah, it's interesting. I had on my other screen, I was just reading that article, not because I knew you were going to ask me about it, just because I was catching up on the day's news there. But one of the pieces that I actually thought was interesting, and I think it was a dean from the Harvard School of Education, made the point that so often we have these discussions, obviously, when we talk about the academic test scores and drops, our reaction these days is to attribute it to the pandemic, right? To say that because kids were out of school, that led to the decline. In this case, what the official from Harvard was saying, was a dean from the graduate school there, was saying that we have to be careful of making that correlation here, that we actually saw a drop in those same metrics that you talked about, Naj, from 2014 to 2018. So this is unfortunately a trend we had already been seeing. Like everything else, right? The pandemic may have impacted that as well. But I think some of those other societal factors, some of the pieces that it's become harder in some cases, in some communities, to frankly, let's call it for what it is. It's become much more controversial to talk about history or teach history, right? I know that's a challenge we hear from our members. So I think it's navigating that. Now, the importance of civic education, I know that there is a huge emphasis. A lot of our leaders, that this is their one piece that they're really trying to figure out, not just in the classroom, but what can we do outside to really give our students that foundation that's necessary. I think this should be seen as a warning sign in terms of what can we more do as a system. And I don't think this falls completely on our schools, because I don't think that's fair. I think this is maybe a indication of some of the bigger societal challenges that we're having around a lot of these tough conversations.
Yeah. I will say this. My daughter, who's a freshman in college, was very excited to be able to register to vote and be part of, understanding civics and all of that. My youngest daughter, a little disappointed that she won't be able to vote by the time the next elections come up. But hey, at least they're excited to be part of the process, and hopefully there will be more of an effort to boost up some of these statistics. Okay, let's talk budget. The Senate put out a budget proposal last week, and of course, we've got the May revision coming up next week, so a lot to talk about. Let's go ahead and bring in our guest, Patty Herrera, Vice President, School Services of California, one of our favorite guests here on the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break. Patty, so great to have you here on the show with us today. As I made mention, the Senate put out their budget proposal calling it Protecting Our Progress. They said in a news release, quote, "This builds on Governor Newsom's January proposed budget and serves as a starting point for negotiations with the Assembly and the governor's administration. The plan includes $26 billion in solutions and builds total reserves to $38.1 billion. Perhaps most important to our viewers right now, there's a proposed additional $3 billion ongoing for schools and community colleges." So after reading just some of the details of that, I know you guys at School Services have gone through it. What was your general feeling about the Senate's proposal between you and your colleagues?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me here. I'm going to have to do something about that picture that you guys put up. Our general reaction, particularly when we weigh it against the governor's January budget, but actually even more when we weigh it against our current fiscal landscape, because we know that state revenues are coming in lower than the governor's January estimates. So our initial reaction to the state Senate's budget plan was, what? and so, you know, of course, we dove into it, and what we recognize is that it's a pretty optimistic plan, and from what we gather from, you know, the document that the Senate put out, you know, yesterday, in our opinion, the Senate's budget plan is delicately balanced on, I think I used that term, I think at your Monterey conference about the governor's budget estimates, but are really delicately balanced on a couple of really big assumptions. And that is that the state and our legislature and our governor would be willing to pass two significant tax policies. And if that doesn't come to fruition, then really the Senate budget's plan really just would collapse because it's built on those assumptions. So, for example, there's they propose a new corporation tax, and then they propose a pause in a tax credit for corporations that overall would yield, in their estimation, about $3 billion ongoing for K-14 education. But those assumptions, they're not doing anything like weird, you know. When you look at the Senate's budget plan, all they're doing is saying how much would these tax policies generate in new state revenues, and then of course K-14 education gets 40% of that, right, under Test 1, Proposition 98. And so the $3 billion is just mathematical based on their revenue assumptions. But again, those revenue assumptions, I think, make a very aggressive assumption that the governor and 2/3 of the legislature would be willing to pass new tax policies. The governor has already indicated, he has already said, I do not support the tax policies included in the Senate's budget plan. And the Assembly has remained silent so far. But I would say that, you know, although I think we tend to pride, you know, some folks tend to pride themselves in the fact that our California state Democrats hold a significant supermajority in both houses of the legislature. But those of us who really study sort of the membership or the membership composition of the legislature, while some Democrats do align themselves with the party, we call them, you know, the moderate caucus. They're still from relatively conservative areas of the state. And for those members, it would be really difficult for them to support tax proposals, particularly for big businesses, or they might feel a political side effect of supporting a tax like that. So it's not even certain that the Assembly would be willing to adopt the Senate's budget approach, which is a tax policy approach.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Herrera, like Steve, I also love listening to you. I always joke with Patty that, I love when we have her on our guest from one of our panels, because then I could just steal our content and then makes me sound good when I go and speak to other groups. So definitely one of the smartest people here that we have in Sacramento, making sense of all the pieces. You kind of alluded to it. I was going to ask you about, where's the $3 billion come from? You talked about that, right? Some of their assumptions. Mm-hmm. I see Denise's comment there, in terms of just, sometimes we hear these proposals from the legislature, it's like, oh my goodness, what, like if this happens, just maybe put a little bit of context on the political end. You kind of alluded to it right now, what the governor feels about it, what the assembly feels about it. At the end of the day, given the context of where we're at in the calendar, the January budget, the May revise, what's your political calculation on just generally speaking, some of these pieces that the Senate has put forward, whether it be the $3 billion or just some of their other broader proposals?
So Naj and I had a chance to just quickly touch bases before the start of the lunch break. But, one of the things that I did note in the Senate's budget plan is it said there was a like a caveat that said, if the landscape changes, then we will have to, visit potential cuts, potential sweeps, potential delay or of implementation of programs. All of those things would be on the table for negotiation. And so in my opinion, that was the Senate's way of saying, like, look, we understand that the tax policy is something that we would have to reach an agreement on. And if it doesn't come to fruition, then our fiscal reality changes pretty significantly, right? So because in January, you guys might remember that the governor had estimated we had a budget shortfall of about almost $19 billion. And to date, according to the Department of Finance, we are almost $5 billion below January estimates, right? So we're looking at already about a $23 billion budget deficit without the Senate's tax plan coming to mitigate the loss of those revenues. So what do you do in a situation like that? That would definitely have a Prop 98 effect. So I think that from just the politics of it already, again, the governor has indicated he's not going to entertain it. The governor is a very business friendly governor. And as the CEO of the state of California, what he prides himself to be, the fourth largest economy in the world under his watch, he's going to be very, very careful about any kind of policies that could potentially detract companies from doing business in California. And these two particular tax policies included in the Senate's plan target businesses. I want to be fair to our colleagues in the Senate that there are proposals to bolster small businesses in California. But when you look at our Silicon Valley, that's not small business. Mm-hmm. And so while, I can certainly understand why the Senate would be sympathetic to supporting small businesses in California, this governor is also looking at those big corporations too.
Folks, Patty Herrera, Vice President of School Services of California, is with us. If you have questions or comments for Patty, go ahead and put those into our chat, and we'll tackle some of those as we go. Patty, let's shift over to May revision, which is supposed to come out next week. With the tax deadline pushed back, what do you think is happening in finance right now? What do you think they're doing to try and solve this numbers game?
I don't know that John's going to take my suggestion, but you guys know that we put cartoons in our slides. And I was like, why don't we just have Chris Ferguson throwing a dart at a board? Right? That's what it's going to feel like, right? I mean, even if at the height of the pandemic, we deferred the tax filing deadline, but only until July, to push the tax filing deadline all the way to the middle of October. We won't be able to true up revenues until the middle of November, right? So there's even a question about, we usually have a budget cleanup in the late summer, right? Where we true up revenues, we clean up some legislation that we didn't get quite right. And there's a question about whether or not even we're going to have cleanup budget this year, because by the time we can clean up, in the middle of November, just a few weeks later, the governor is going to come out with his next budget. So do we just wait, right? So I do think that it's going to make the deferred tax deadline, and especially given how far out we deferred the tax filing deadline, creates a little bit of a black hole in terms of our ability to project revenues. One of the things that the LAO watches really, really closely, and they publish this on a monthly basis, is income tax withholdings reported by employers, because that's an indication of taxes to be paid. Mm-hmm. And they have this pretty illustrative chart that they publish that shows that our income tax withholdings are so far below last year. And so it's hard to ignore the numbers. And so I think that the governor, I would suspect that the Department of Finance and the governor is going to take a little bit more of a conservative approach, unlike the Senate, and not putting a tax proposal on, as part of the budget negotiation. The governor is going to have to come to some kind of reality about where we are financially. So we could see a little bit more of a sobered May revision from January. He's going to have to accept the fact that we're almost $5 billion below estimates at this point. But I don't think he's going to be willing to sort of do a doomsday scenario, because we really don't have any idea what revenues are going to be when they materialize in the middle of October. That said, I mean, you got to look at the overall sort of trajectory of the economy. And even that, it's anyone's guess, right? The the Federal Reserve took action today. How's the stock market going to respond to that, right? And so it's anybody's guess. So I think that, well, again, we'll see a little bit more of a sobered May revision, my guess is, but not too draconian, because there's just a big question mark hanging out there for us.
Patty, I'll take our viewers behind the scenes, or at least this is how it worked at ACSA or any of the places that follow the state budget, right? So next Thursday or Friday, whenever it comes out, the governor gets on his press conference. Unlike Jerry Brown, Governor Newsom usually has a little bit more to say, and as he admitted, he's a little more long-winded. And most of us that are trying to figure out the budget, we're listening in one ear, but we're already going into the document, seeing what's in there. Yeah. So next week, what are the things you're looking for when the budget gets released? What are those key points that are really going to be the big drivers, obviously impacting our folks? What are those things you're looking for?
Yeah. For me, the first thing I start is big picture. What does 98 look like? Right. So in January, he had Proposition 98 measured at about $106 billion. Are we going to see that drop by $2 billion? Maybe. And so and if Proposition 98 drops, and we have some cost increases already inherent, because COLA ticked up just a little bit. And I will tell you guys that COLA at 8.22% really only amounts to $70 million additional costs because of LCFF, and then giving categorical programs their equal cost of living adjustment. So it's not that significant of a liability to Proposition 98, the cost of living adjustment. But already remember that the governor reduced the arts and music discretionary block grant by 30% to borrow, or not borrow, he's not giving it back, to take $1.2 billion from that block grant to use it to cover the costs of LCFF and his equity multiplier proposal, right? And so, we don't like that approach. We don't like using one-time money for an ongoing obligation. But I think the governor, I don't see, if Proposition 98 decreases, I think that the governor is going to hold steady to his one-time use approach. I think that he's probably going to stand steadfast behind his sweep of the arts and music discretionary block grant. Some are even suggesting that, he may sweep the balance of it, and not just the 30% reduction. I don't know that we'll necessarily need to go that far. So the other thing too is the big equity that was the big one, right? The biggest policy proposal outside of the cut was the equity multiplier. I wouldn't anticipate any big changes to that. I know people are on pins and needles on ELOP, right? Like, look, if the guarantee's dropping, we know that there's that $4 billion ongoing program out there in the ELOP. That is just a darling of both the governor and the legislature. I can't see this governor proposing any significant changes to the ELOP. And I also can't see him or the legislature, and the Senate's budget plan reinforced this, at least for the Assembly side. I can't see any of them dipping into the rainy day funds, either the states or the education rainy day fund. That would require, frankly, the governor to declare a budget emergency. And I don't think this governor is going to declare a budget emergency. Think of it this way. Like our rainy day fund is for when it's raining. We are not in an economic recession right now. Right. So why would we dip into our rainy day fund if we're not even in an economic recession? And that recession could be coming later this winter or early in 2024. So they're going to hold those chits back just in case they need them in the future.
Patty, I'm going to steal the opportunity from Naj. I'm going to squeeze in one last question here before we get to the bottom of the hour. Kind of switching gears from the May revise, but connected to the May revise. This issue that we talked about at the front end of the show of Oakland, San Francisco, we saw LA, school services. You guys are helping in negotiations throughout the state. So I feel like you have a pretty good pulse of what's going on. What trends are you guys seeing? I mean, are these anomalies what we're seeing in some of these districts, or should folks kind of gear up for tougher negotiations?
Yeah, I think the use of a strike, particularly, some would argue that that the labor partners in these districts have not exhausted the impasse process, the statutory impasse process, to conduct a legal strike. We know that that's something that's being litigated with the LAUSD strike, and so there's questions about that. But I'm not sure that we would say that we're going to see a growing number of school districts going out there to strike, because that's pretty obviously pretty drastic. However, we are seeing tougher and tougher conversations at the negotiating table. We anticipate that we're going to see more districts enter into impasse and potentially fact finding as they negotiate. I think honestly, because both districts and their labor partners alike are trying to sort of read the future fiscal tea leaves and figure out what it is that the labor partners are like. Look, we've got to put food on our table in an era of a high cost environment, and districts can see they in doing their multi-year projections about whether or not they're going to be able to afford that, particularly if the economy should enter into a recession, and what happens if Proposition 98 revenue were to go down, right? So there's these tensions coming at the table. So we do anticipate we're going to see more impasse.
All right. Patty Herrera, Vice President, School Services of California. Patty, thank you so much for joining us. We can't wait to find out what your impressions are of the May revision. And next time we have you on, I want you to somehow fit in this phrase that you used, because this was magic today. Delicately balanced. Anytime you come back here on the show, you're going to have to fit that into the discussion.
Okay. You got it.
Thanks, Patty, very much. Appreciate you being here with us. Folks, if you like what you see, join us, subscribe to us on YouTube, or like us on Facebook. You'll get instant updates when we're about to come on the air live, plus a promotion for whenever we have a live and interactive ACSA Legislative Lunch Break coming up on Wednesdays. Also, we want to amplify the great stories happening in your school districts. If you have something to tell us about, photos, talking points, any good stories happening, we'll put those in EdCal for you. Go ahead and send that information and those photos to our EdCal editor, Michelle Caro, at mcarl@acsa.org. And a couple of programming notes for you. As Edgar and I mentioned near the top, he and I will be at the Lead with Pride conference coming up over the rest of this week down in San Diego. And then next week, we would normally have a Wednesday show, but we have our governance meetings here in Sacramento. But we will be on the air with a live and interactive special edition of the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break on May Revision Day. So that could come Thursday, that could come Friday. So stay tuned. Again, if you subscribe to us or like us on YouTube or Facebook, you'll get an update when we're about to come on the air. Edgar, I know we are at the bottom of the hour, but I just wanted to give you an opportunity just to kind of reflect on what Patty had to say as we head into the May revision, and maybe some things that really stuck out that our members need to be aware of.
Yeah, I take away the piece that Patty was talking about, that, yeah, while we're in every one of our message, and I think that's going to be the theme next week, that the numbers are looking different, and it's obviously not as bright of a fiscal picture as maybe we've been seeing, but yet that, I think she was tempered in terms of just what is that actually going to mean in the field. And I think that, at least for this year, while we were hearing a little bit of the angst, I know the questions we get from our members about kind of what the impact's going to be on the COLA, on some of these other proposals. Also, I think that people are quick to think, are some of the things that we've invested in over the last couple of years, the ELOP, the transitional kindergarten, are we going to see a rollback of that? And I think what I've appreciated about school services, we've been saying the same thing. Others is pretty consistent. We've seen no signs of that, and I think that it's the state and the governor in particular is going to stay the course on that end, whether our folks like it or not, right? We know that there's some folks who might feel differently, but I think it is prudent to think about some of those as commitments, that it's in all of our best interest to just see that we not only have the resources, but that we're putting the efforts on the ground try to implement those. Obviously, and I know we're trying to continue to be mindful of what those needs are in the field. If there's through that implementation, whether it be flexibility or what is it that our folks need that we could advocate for here in Sacramento.
Yeah, makes sense. All right, folks, thank you so much for joining us today on the ACSA Legislative Lunch Break. We are live Wednesdays, 1 p.m. on ACSA Facebook and ACSA YouTube. Again, next week we will be on with our special edition of the Lunch Break, either Thursday or Friday, depending on when the governor decides to flip the switch and bring out his May revision. Have a great rest of the day and rest of the week. We'll see you next time.